Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Grace Mauser. I'm the policy manager with B Lab US and Canada. I am so excited to be here with all of you. Excited there's a lot of energy around this topic. We have a really great agenda today and some great speakers lined up for you. But first, I just wanted to quickly, let's go to the next slide and look at the agenda. So first, I'll talk a little bit about why we're here. Then we're going to hear from Francis Sawyer, who is the founder of Play-D Strategy, about the political context for ESG that we find ourselves in. Next, we'll hear from Ann Kelly with Series about messaging your values, messaging around ESG. And she's going to talk about a lot of the great work that Series has done on this. Then we'll move on to talking about the relationship between ESG and DEI, JEDI, and diversity initiatives with Tynesia Boyer-Robinson from CapEQ. And then we'll hear from our very own Holly Ensign-Barstow with B Lab US and Canada about the place B Corps have in this. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So please keep that in mind, jot things down as we go. But before we do that, we can go to the next slide. And I just want to take a couple minutes to ground us in why we're here and what the purpose of this webinar is. So obviously, we all want to talk and learn more about ESG. And as many of you know, technically ESG is a financial framework to assess the environmental, social, and governance performance of a company or a portfolio. So we hopefully agree for the most part that responsible business requires an understanding of and transparency about business risks and opportunities. And this is what ESG is designed to address. Recently, though, and the reason we're really here is the term has become more political. And some policymakers have shifted what ESG means in the political realm into the broader public. So we can go to the next slide here. I wanna highlight how ESG relates to B Corp certification. It's intertwined, but it is distinct. The certification is a comprehensive and objective measure of a business's impact on society. And it doesn't include measurements of a business's financial performance. Now, as B Lab, and hopefully many of you as B Corps, believe that purpose and profit need to be in balance, and that we can do this by treating employees fairly, creating good jobs, operating sustainably, contributing to local communities. And B Corps show that measuring and managing your non-financial impact helps build business resilience and bottom line results in the long term. But we also want to recognize that anti-ESG sentiment has a ripple effect that really impedes B Corp's way of doing business. And that's why we're here and why it's important to understand the role that B Corps can play in this debate. And the important role, I hope many of you will step up to play after today. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers. We can go to the next slide. So I mentioned this up top, but we have 4 amazing speakers with us today. I'll introduce them both previously and ahead of when they actually speak. But for now, I'll actually go ahead and pass it on to Francis Sawyers, who is the founder of Play-D Strategy and also a driving force behind the Sunrise Project. Both entities have been really integral partners for B Lab as we understand and navigate the ESG landscape. So I'm happy that she was able to join us, and please welcome Francis.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace, and everyone. It is awesome to be here with y'all. This is a policy trend that I've been watching with many, many peers and colleagues across the country and world this last year, plus as we have seen these attacks on responsible investment coming from a number of different places within the policy and governmental ecosystem in the States. So my name is Frances Sawyer. As Grace said, I run Pleiades Strategy, and we have been really tracking and trying to understand what is going on with the trends in this, what has been called the anti-ESG movement. Next slide, please. So we'll be going through a brief overview of where we are today. I'm then going to dive into a few pieces around the state work that is going on, because I think the state policy landscape really tells us a lot about what is happening and the levers of power that are being targeted, and then talk for a moment or two about what is next and the really, really crucial role of businesses in this effort to defend against this anti-ESG movement, and for speaking up for business as a force for good, as B Corp does all the time. So I want to start us with the progress that has been made, and B Corp has been instrumental in that. The mission, make a business a force for good. We have huge strides in drawing attention to some of the long-term factors, the social, governmental, environmental governance and environmental factors that are leading to businesses contributing to their communities and running strong operations hand in hand. Next slide, please. And so I want to ground this current political moment we're in the progress that's been made over the last 10 years. There have been huge strides to articulate and disclose climate environmental risk and to respond to those risks. There's been a really big step forward in understanding the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace for employers, for attracting talent, for bringing in customers and understanding all the stakeholders involved in the company. Big push on workers' rights and the understanding that how we treat a workforce really, really matters, both socially and to the bottom line, and a focus on governance. And as each of these pieces have been made material and have gained traction and have started to shift the flows of global capital, folks who don't believe in these things have seen this progress as a roadblock to their effort. So I really want to ground us in the reason we are seeing pushback is because of the work that has been done to date to really uplift all of this long-term just good practice and make it more and more a core and an uplifted part of doing business. Next slide, please. So about 2 years ago, we started to see these first policy actions that were going after companies that were putting these practices into action, and at the same time really moving in parallel with stronger regulations that would standardize some of the best practices and make them industry norms through the regulatory process. And so we started to see this pushback. It started to show up as model legislation that was passed state house to state house. It was brought together groups of attorneys generals from the right who threatened legal action against folks who were working on these factors. And we also saw a new politicization of state treasurer offices, an office that really hadn't been politicized much prior, as they are the fiduciaries of the state. Next slide. In the last 6 months, we have seen this really balloon and more attention and more levers of powers. We now have a club of anti-ESG Republican governors. We have congressional action hearings and bills that you probably were following this summer through the House Oversight Committee on Financial Services. committees. We had presidential posturing as we begin to get into this 2024 electoral cycle. And we see that this anti-ESG pushback has become an economic pillar of the right-wing sort of policy platform. Next slide, please. And this has not been an organic effort. There are distinct organizations behind this, and we have been able to follow these ideas and pieces of model legislation through various organizations that have been, working like ALEC and the Heritage Foundation to propose model legislation, pushing campaigns and getting political attention to them, like Consumers Research and the Heritage Foundation's C4. We have folks testifying in states from this coordinated group of actors that are collaborating, have a deep network of funders behind them, and are really pushing at multiple levers of power these anti-ESG platforms that are trying to hold companies back from being able to make this type of decision that takes these long-term risks into account. So next slide. And what has happened on the state policy landscape? They say the states are the laboratories of democracy. This is really, really true in this case. And there's a lot that we can learn from what happened in the states during the 2023 legislative session, where we really saw many of these ideas being pushed forward and coming to life. Next slide. The session report, we saw 167 bills in 37 states. 22 laws have passed, but there are 88 that died, and they came across a huge group of opposition that came from a real diversity of places. Next slide, please. You can see the map here where these bills were introduced, and from coast to coast, you had folks from business, labor, environmental organizations, civil rights organizations stepping up and saying that these policies are bad policies and they're really holding us back in the goals that we wish to see for the way we manage funds. Next slide. The policy targets are diverse. I think that's one of the things as a watcher that I've been really amazed by, is they're going after multiple levers of state financial regulation. We're looking at contracting authority, pension management, worker-owned capital. We're looking at personal ESG scores and different disclosure requirements. Insurance is a new fight in this. And each of these policy targets is really fit under the big umbrella of the anti-ESG political backlash, and is really designed to change the conversation and to hold us back from the forward momentum that has been made. Next slide. And there's that chilling effect, and there's that, risk of this uncertain new. And we also know that it's bad policy that's driving cost. And so from testimony from Texas to Oklahoma, we saw increased lending rates that states and city governments were having to pay. We had folks having to go back to financiers when they were told they couldn't contract with specific banks and certain companies. And we also saw, next slide, that there's a potential really, really large ding on public worker pensions, the retirement benefits that are part of that deferred compensation for workers across America that would come from instituting some of these more egregious policies in places like Indiana, where the state expected a drop in pension returns of over 6.7 billion in the next decade. Next slide. The great news is that there has been an amazing diversity of opposition to these bills in places like Missouri, where a DEI provision that would ban the state from contracting with a firm that had a DEI pledge, that got stopped when the business community stepped up. There was a big sign-on letter, and it was stopped in its tracks, that budget amendment. In Virginia, you had the retirement system itself say, wait, this is not our fiduciary in our fiduciary duty to have this policy as something that we need to respond to. We need to be able to hold on to our ability to look and assess all risk and manage the funds in a way that really lets us steward that capital for the long term for our members. And in Arizona, you had retirees, labor unions, bankers association step up, testify, and ended up being able to shepherd a gubernatorial veto to hold the line. And so, last slide, please. As we look ahead, we know that this fight is going to continue. We've seen a tremendous backlash to the backlash, you could say. And I think that where it's coming from, the diversity of voices, business has really stood up as a core and really moving voice in this. And so when folks who have a site and a facility in a district are looking at that state policy landscape and see these bills coming down that want to shape and constrain the decisions that can be made to invest for the better and to put in place some of these really practical, common sense risk factors and things that align with the B Corp mission. Having your voice in this fight, as y'all brought it into Maine and North Carolina and had conversations with, I know a host of members and lawmakers, that really moves folks and is really, really instrumental in helping us out.
Thank you so much, Frances. And I'm sure you guys have some questions after that, but we will have all questions and discussion at the end. So please feel free to put it in the Q&A box in the meantime. So now we are going to transition to Ann Kelly, who is the Vice President of Government Relations at Ceres. And she is going to be talking about some of the work Ceres has been doing and specifically about what they have found to be effective in terms of pro-ESG messaging and pushing back on this anti-ESG sentiment that Frances was just telling us about. So Ann, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Grace, and a pleasure to be with all of you today. And thanks so much to Frances. I mean, I'm in a better mood now, just being reminded of all the good news that she just put forward. And I hope to build on that. Let's go to the next slide. For those of you who may not be familiar with Ceres, we are a nonprofit organization working with company and investor leaders to address some of the greatest sustainability challenges. We were founded in 1989 in the wake of the Exxon Valdez spill. Next slide. The Ceres Businesses for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy Network, otherwise known as BICEP, consists of 80 major companies committed to policy advocacy at the state and federal level. And I'm thrilled that a good number of BICEP members are B Corp members, including some of our founders. Thank you so much for being part of the network. And it's good to see so many familiar names on today's call. Next slide. Now, Frances gave a tremendous overview of the political landscape that brought us to this moment. And before I dive into the results of message testing and related guidance, I just want to underscore something she said, which is that your success has led to this attack. We have all come a long way in integrating sustainability and climate change into capital markets, and it's now mainstream business practice. And that is why we are facing a brutal political attack by the fossil fuel industry on our achievements and enormous gains in accelerating the shift to a stronger, more resilient economy. Frances made this clear, but I want to underscore it once again. We need to understand the origins of this movement. And I should say that my comments today are largely focused on the E of ESG, though I am a huge fan of the E, the S, and the G. I'm going to be turning it over to other experts to talk about the S and G. Next slide. We all know that climate and other sustainability risks are, in fact, business risks. And when it comes to this debate, the bottom line is that companies and investors must be free to take all risks and opportunities into account without interference of politics. And of course, this is true whether it's an inflation risk, a labor shortage, a pandemic risk, or climate change. These are material risks that you all face. Next slide. I think the good news is that materiality is something that both sides of the aisle can come together on. Likewise, good corporate governance, prudent risk management, things like responsible business practices are good business actions that everyone can agree on. But how these practices are actually communicated can change the way they're perceived. And I think that's really the core of my message today. We have a workshop in New York called What's in a Name, Well, it turns out everything is in the name. And let's run through some of the data that we have on this front. If we go to the next slide, we're going to look at some data backing this up, collected by our friends at the Potential Energy Coalition. And we'll start with the term ESG, which, just to be really clear, Ceres has championed for our 30 plus years of existence. As of a poll done only a few months ago, only approximately 1 in 4 Americans has even heard of ESG investing. And among those who've heard of the term, less than half have a favorable view towards it. Next slide. But take a word like clean energy or responsible investing, and both familiarity and favorability jump significantly, including among ESG skeptics in the survey. So clean energy, responsible investing. Next slide. Addressing environmental risks also has a very high favorability. 59% of American voters rated environmental risks as strong or very strong arguments for ESG, including 69% of Democrats and 52% of Republicans. And of course, this has to be highlighted when we think about the kind of tragic extreme weather events we have seen this summer. Addressing those risks is actually extremely popular. Next slide. There is more good news. 91% of ESG skeptics agree that companies can do what is right and still make profits. We know that from the past year, it's not all that simple, but what we can glean from these surveys, I think, is that there's certain terms companies can use to communicate their commitments to sustainability and other values while maintaining favorability to the public. Clear terms that tell your what are going to go over very, very well. Next slide. We don't have time to get into all of the details today, but the Potential Energy Coalition has put together some really helpful messaging guidelines that you can see here. And with a few of those key messages, I think this can be really useful. We are going to be, of course, circulating these slides, and I also encourage all of you to attend an in-person event that Ceres and the B Lab are co-hosting during Climate Week in New York City, coming up toward the end of the month. If you're able to go to the next slide, I can highlight this. It is an invitation only, closed to the press event on the 19th. It is for companies and investors only, and it will include an in-depth presentation on the polling data and on the specific messaging guidance from John Marshall, who's the founder of the Potential Energy Coalition. And I certainly hope to see you there if you're going to be at Climate Week. And now, to quickly wrap up the polling, I want to highlight that freedom, next slide, freedom is one of the terms with the greatest favorability across the aisle. Nobody owns the word freedom. You can't go wrong with the word freedom. Left, right, center. Business practices need freedom. And to the next slide, that is why Ceres launched Freedom to Invest back in March with a statement signed by over 250 companies and investors that really just affirm their commitment to sustainability and call on policymakers to protect the freedom to invest. Let me thank those of you who signed on to our statement. Since March, we had nearly 100 more companies and investors join, and additional stakeholders have released public statements, including academic leaders, healthcare providers, faith leaders, and state financial officials, all unified in this messaging around the freedom to invest and protecting the freedom to invest responsibly. Next slide. Businesses and companies are also speaking out as individuals. This is really important through op-eds, blog posts, news articles. A few of the business voices are featured right here on this slide, including B Corp's very own Globe Collaborative. Thank you, Stuart. Next slide. I want to call out one critical investor voice, Kirsty Jenkinson, who is Investment Director for Sustainable Investment and Stewardship Strategies at the California State Teachers Retirement System. That's CalSTRS, the second largest pension fund in the country. Because it's really companies and investors who are together in this fight. And the second part of her quote really struck me: to ask us to ignore pervasive risks, such as the market disruptions caused by climate change, and to ignore investment opportunities in the transition to a low carbon economy. is asking us to stop doing our jobs. Plain and simple. This is a straightforward comment from an important major pension fund that is sticking up for workers, for teachers, for firemen and women, and people who need retirement funds in the future. I really want to highlight the quote. Next slide. I think these messages in the next slide are all obvious to all of you, and I can't think of a better proof point for what's being said here than what Francis said earlier, which is that many of those state bills went down crashing and burning once folks looked at the economics and realized that members of their state and pensioners were going to lose money if these bills were passed. I think we all know this is true, especially that last comment. The economy will be stronger and more resilient if businesses can make their own decisions. I'm really looking forward to your questions in our discussion, and I'll kick it back to you, Grace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Lots of great data and thoughts to dig into there. But before we do that, and again, please write down questions in the Q&A box or on a pen and paper, and we'll get to them at the end. I am excited to welcome to the virtual stage Tanisha Boye Robinson, who is the CEO and president of CapEQ, another valued B Lab partner. And she's going to talk a bit about the relationship between anti-ESG attacks and DEI and diversity, and how really those, we can't do one without the other. So please, the stage is yours, Tanisha.
Thank you, Grace. And I tell you what, I don't want to follow Francis or Anne ever again, but I'm just really grateful for their data, for their poise, and all of the information that they're sharing that's equipping us for this moment. And you're going to hear a lot of things that are similar across our presentations because we're all reinforcing each other's work. And I have to kind of start where basically Anne started, that climate injustice and racial injustice are systemic risks. Let me say it again for the people in the back, because I don't have slides. We're just going to have a conversation. Climate injustice and racial injustice are systemic risks. And it is business's job to manage those risks. In fact, it's business's job, if you're doing a great job, to find opportunity to replace those risks. So you've heard a lot about the climate side of what those risks are, but let's talk about what inequity and injustice looks like from a racial standpoint and why it's a risk. There have been tons of studies now about the billions of dollars that companies have lost due to bias and racial inequity in their workforce. It leads to absenteeism. It leads to turnover. It leads to not having the best talent for the work that you have. It leads to not being able to tap into businesses that can be more profitable and powerful because of knowing communities that you don't. In short, it leads to 16 trillion with a T dollars lost in our economy over the last 20 years. It is the compounding injustice and bias in our business and economic systems that have led our economy to lose money, where instead of in the next 5 years, we'd be adding $5 trillion to the economy. And I wanted to start there with what the risk means and what the quantifiable data is behind it, because in light of those staggering numbers, the lawsuits that are nipping at the heels of different organizations for managing to that risk, in fact, finding the opportunity in that, making sure that there is changes, is small. It's minuscule compared to what our economy has been bleeding as a result of not really centering the needs of people of color and communities of color across this nation. So when you think about that, when you think about all of that, the E, S, and G, yes, and I saw in the comment, ESG has been used as not just a financial platform, but also as a mitigant of risk. But if we're very honest with ourselves, there's been a lot more focus on E over the last few decades than the S and the G. And only recently, over the last 5 or so years, are you seeing an outpouring, an outcry for reasons from COVID to George Floyd and others. Let's really dig down on what we mean by the S. And the S, frankly, is where the DEI comes from. The S is basically where the diversity, equity, and inclusion work lands. It also lands in governance as well. So that's the intersection of the work. You cannot do one without the other. It's about human rights. It's about equality. It's about basic fairness. You may not love the term racial inequity if you're opposed to ESG, but you do love the term, if you're an American, a fair shot. You do love the term as American, an equal opportunity. And that's what the S and the G really are for. And it's owning the fact that over time, historically, there have been populations that have been intentionally excluded from having access to opportunity. So as a business owner, especially with demographics that are shifting to be predominantly of color, it is in your best business interest to make sure that you are building equitable and inclusive companies, period. Now, before we get into a little bit more details about what that looks like in practice, I want to pause because there's a lot to celebrate about how much momentum there's been and really the backlash against the backlash. But what we want to do is make sure that, if the colloquial term is hate the sin, not the sinner, there's a reason why there's so many people glomming on to this concept of anti-ESG. There are 100 million people in poverty in the United States, and 25% of them are white. There is something about the pushback on environment. There's something about the pushback on racial inequity that is exacerbating a feeling that I am getting left behind. That's what's pushing the movement. It is companies like yours that are actually focusing on removing and reducing the inequities that actually will alleviate that real human emotion of feeling left behind, of feeling lack of opportunity. So how do you do that in practice when people basically have a bullseye on your back if you're focusing on anything related to DEI and ESG? You've already heard some communication tools. I want to give you some operational tools. The first thing is, let's not get into a semantic fight, right? We're not going to go back and forth on ESG and DEI. What we really want to talk about is this has to be fully integrated into your companies. You are at the most risk of having a bullseye on your back if ESG and DEI work is a side hustle. I like to call it the difference between the main course and the parsley on your plate. If it's a thing you do on the side because it's something that you like to do, it doesn't feel core to your business model. But if it is the main point of your business model, it's not ESG or DEI. This is my business. My business is creating a climate that actually is resilient. My business is creating opportunity for all Americans. Then you can't dismantle my business. I have the freedom to invest, and I have the freedom to start and lead my own business. And so what does that look like in practice? It's pulling every lever of your company in service of equitable outcomes. That's how you make your money. So making sure that your core business model and how you generate revenue for your company is focused on not just benefiting communities of color, but making sure they're not excluded. It's how you spend your money and what you spend in service of your core business model. That's everything from the direct spending to a product or service, to vendors, to communication support, heck, to foundation and support outside of your walls. And it's how you treat your people. The people who come to work every day, making sure that your business prospers and thrives. How are you ensuring that they also have access and opportunity to the economic mainstream? You see, that is what DEI is about. It's not just about the person next to you and what they look like. It's about whether or not at every angle and every lever of your business, they have opportunity. And so if someone comes at you about DEI and it's every lever of your business fundamentally into your core business model, that's just the way you work. And they're attacking your entire company, not just an initiative. So when you think about what that feels like in practice as you work through some of the backlash and the challenges that we're facing right now, there are a handful of very quantifiable and short-term things that people can focus on. And I'm really appreciative to our partners at PolicyLink and the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance who outline some of them. First is this: you must protect your existing programs and initiatives. And this might feel really tactical, but sometimes it comes down to the question you ask. You see, right now, with all of the litigation happening, a lot of folks are feeling like they need to go to their counsel, rightfully so. You should be scared. There should be a little bit of focus on what you're saying and what you're doing as it works to this. But that said, there's a difference when you come to your counsel and you say, how do you keep us from being attacked versus how do you help us protect the work that we're doing? So that's one. Number two, you have to be mindful of the talent pipeline. You have to continue to invest in that talent pipeline work to make sure that your demographics are representative of the country we are becoming. Otherwise, you will be behind the 8 ball when it comes to the best talent. And last but not least, you need to partner with others. Partner with the effective communities in your work. Partner with coalitions like Ceres. You may not always be able to use the own voice of your company, but in coalition and partnership, we can definitely make the difference that we need. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ty. I see you have some questions. Actually, all of our panelists have questions in the Q&A box that we can get to at the end. So please take a look at those so you'll have time. All right, so now we will move on to Holly Ensign-Barstow, who is the Senior Director of Programs and Policy at B Lab US and Canada, who's hopefully gonna synthesize some of what we've been hearing and focus in on what B Corp's role should be in this ESG, DEI debate landscape that we find ourselves in now. So Holly, over to you whenever you're ready. And hey, Ron, I think we're going to go back to slides, which you are on top of. All right, thanks, both.
Thanks, Grace. It's wonderful to be here with my amazing colleagues from Pleiades, Ceres, and CAPIQ. Thank you so much for providing so many incredible, important insights. Many of you know me pretty well. I've been at B Lab for a very long time now, but what you may not know is that when I originally joined almost 12 years ago, it was to work on advocacy and organizing B Corps across the country and the world. So policymaking, the legislative process, and corporate advocacy have really been a part of our movement since its inception. And I truly believe it's a fundamental part of what it means to be a B Corp. As a community, we have worked together to pass over 50 laws in jurisdictions around the world to enable stakeholder governance. We've done this by working across the aisle with bipartisan sponsors and by demonstrating what business for good looks like for real people and why encouraging more companies like B Corps is better for local communities, the environment, our broader society, and for workers. What we know from all of that amazing experience is that the business voice is powerful. B Corps are powerful. And if we wield that voice effectively, we can create true change. Next slide, please. But what about this moment in time? What is the role of our community today? Based on past experience, business for good should not be partisan. The impact that you have on real people in local communities is something to be celebrated and encouraged. The B Corp movement has always welcomed people from all political stripes. In truth, we all come to the idea of business for good from different backgrounds and for different reasons. And as we've learned from the amazing partners on the call, many of the B Corp practices that you have all embedded in your DNA are supported by the vast majority of the public. ESG, DEI, technical weird terms that maybe people don't really understand, but what they do understand is the business voice that can point to the real impact and share stories of why operating with a purpose is better business, but also better for us all. I think it's those stories and that impact that we need to bring to this moment. And we need to share those stories with people in the media and on the ground in state legislatures and in the halls of Congress. Next slide. This is not an easy ask and can probably seem a bit daunting for many of you. Everyone does have a role to play, but we recognize that some people may be more equipped than others to set forward with us on this journey. However, we are all here to help. Everyone on the call is here to help you. At B Lab US in Canada, over the past year, we've organized policy trainings, easy on-ramps to policy engagement through congressional fly-ins, and opportunities to collaborate with your peers through something that we call our bi-monthly policy collaboration call. But in this moment, we know we need to do more. As a first step, we've created some messaging guidance that should help you navigate talking about being a B Corp in this current moment. This messaging highlights why being a B Corp is better business to demonstrate to policymakers why they should actually be encouraging instead of discouraging our movement. It highlights how anti-ESG and anti-DEI legislation could negatively impact our community directly, and provide some points that should appeal to policymakers regardless of their party affiliation. So for purple and red states. These talking points are a starting place and will definitely evolve over time with your help. They are not meant to be comprehensive. And in fact, many of our partners here today, including Ceres and Sunrise, have produced their own more general talking points that you should utilize as well. Ours are truly specific to the B Corp community and their role in this moment. I want to recognize that we've had over 360 people register for this webinar. This is obviously a topic that our community cares about. And I hope you see yourselves reflected in this messaging and that you're ready to join with us to step forward and not back down. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Grace.
Thanks, Holly. So I'm briefly going to go over a couple of calls to action we have for all of you, and then we will turn it over to the questions you have and your ideas. So, hey, Ron, if we could go forward one slide. Thanks so much. I'll also drop a few links in the chat now. So first, we have created a form designed to partner with this webinar to gauge where you're at in terms of readiness to dive into this topic, and what you need from B Lab and from our partners to get more information, to get more support. So please take the time to fill that out. I don't think it'll take more than 5 minutes, and it'll really help us figure out how best to support and organize the B Corp movement going forward. We also, as Holly mentioned, are going to have an ESG and DEI talking point document coming out soon. Should be in your inboxes later this week, so keep an eye out. I also wanted to highlight Ceres Freedom to Invest letter, which Anne talked about. So take a look at that and please sign on if you haven't. Additionally, we really want to encourage you to continue the conversation on the Beehive and have made a thread explicitly dedicated to that. And then finally, the next three are all just about keeping an eye out for the opportunities that come your way, chances to educate your policymakers on what you're doing, engaging in the opportunities that B Lab and our partners put in front of you. B Corp and Voices are so important here. And that includes around the climate disclosure rule. And then before I sign off, I'll echo Ty's call just to really hold the line. Don't back down from what's been working for your business, what you see working for your communities, and just dive in with bravery on this. And we want to support you however we can. So I will stop there. I think we can take down the slides. And I see we have a good number of questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to voice some of these over, and then whichever speaker feels moved to address this can just hop off mute and do so. So the first one I'm seeing is actually directed at Sunrise. So Francis, if you want to take this, what's the horizon in states where anti-ESG bills are still alive? Who's next, and how might we take action today?
Awesome, amazing question. And the answer is there is unfortunately going to be, we expect a lot of movement again this year, and it's going to be a very active legislative season. Most sessions begin in January and run through the late spring. And we have a couple of sessions that are still open from the 2023 cycle. Ohio comes to mind, where policies could still move this year. But the ones that we're really watching there are 42 bills that, due to a 2-year legislative horizon, will carry over into 2024. And so the states where those are present: Arkansas, Georgia, Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, about 6 other states. We know that there will be something on the docket in those states. We also know that the number of policy targets has expanded towards the end of last session, with new requirements for companies to perhaps disclose that they utilize ESG factors and to disclose that that might impact returns, which is not grounded in the data, but that is a new model that we saw surface kind of midway through last session. We've also seen insurance as a key target open up with a model bill that came into Texas. That could be another potential new front. And so I think, we'll be monitoring this landscape and in really close contact with Grace and Holly, and making sure they know when and where different policies are proposed. And starting now, reach out to your lawmakers. Think about where you have a headquarters or a facility or have a business footprint, and get to know the folks who represent you in your state house. Talk to them, tell them why this topic matters to you. And if it's in one of these states, one of the 37 states where we've seen these policies proposed, let them know why this is important to your business, and tell them your story. All of the communications tips that Anne discussed, that Holly put forth, really having these conversations with lawmakers is the way to change minds.
Thanks, Frances. And I'll add, if you want to reach out to your policymakers but aren't sure where to start, that's why I'm here. Send me an email. I'll drop it in the chat soon, but we're happy to work with you on that. So now I'm going to go to a question for Ty. Can you speak more to the $16 trillion loss due to racial injustice? How can we frame that connection simply for C-suites to see the clear connection?
Absolutely. And I included a link in the chat to the moderator, so maybe you can share that with the group afterwards. So it's really simple. When you have people who are denied access, then you don't have customers, period. And when you think about the demographic shift, with the majority of the country moving to be people of color, if you have exclusionary practices, you have now put a funnel that is too tight on your talent. You put a funnel that is too tight on your consumer base. And you're also starting to put a funnel on capital that's available to land. So that's the short story of it. And data is data. Like, the demographics are growing as they're growing, and you can't actually shift that tide. So that's probably the most blunt and straightforward version of it, for what it's worth.
Thank you. All right, so I am actually not sure who the best is to answer this question. Maybe Anne at first blush, but we have a question around the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Justice 40 initiative, and wondering if you can just speak to any progress that's happening on that. And then there's also a question about support from B Lab or from our partners about helping states that are using state policy to prevent us from gaining access to federal funds.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. And I'm thrilled that someone raised this, because the best offense to the anti-ESG debate is to encourage the freedom to invest in America, which is what the IRA is all about. And it's not just about the E, which it is, of course, about the transition to a clean energy economy. It is embedded with environmental justice and with the S. So the incentives built into the IRA are favoring those companies who are building in America, who are establishing unions, who are treating workers well. The Biden administration has also set up the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is the largest fund ever designed for disadvantaged communities. And Justice 40 was also referenced in the question, which is a policy to make certain that 40% of all benefits derived from both the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the IRA are directed toward disadvantaged communities. There's work to be done here, but we can certainly say that this is an enormous accomplishment, one we need to track carefully. We need to give states the freedom to invest in projects that are going to bring capital, jobs, clean energy to their states. A perfect example is Q-Cells in northern Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, which is bringing thousands of solar jobs to the area, and one that Republican Governor Kemp, robustly supported. So there is a real relationship between the investments encouraged by the IRA and giving people the freedom to invest in America, especially in red states, And red state lawmakers who did not support the IRA are tending to welcome with open arms those investment projects. Now, as you saw from Governor DeSantis, they're not all welcoming the money, which is odd, to say the very least. Some of them are going to push that money away. To underscore what Grace said a moment ago, though, if you are in a red state, and if you are in Texas, and your business is in Texas, you should be talking to your lawmaker about what that you actually would like to see investments that come from the IRA, that you really support Justice 40. And fundamentally, that you don't support restrictions on the free flow of capital, because it just doesn't make business sense in any way, shape, or form. And by the way, it's certainly not conservative. Thanks.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, like everything Anne just said, like this wave of investment that we're seeing in clean energy technologies that is driven by the IRA and that is really, really supporting an industrial policy, supporting new labor organizing efforts and domestic jobs across the country is crucial. This is part of the sea change that the opposition is seeing and they're threatened by. I think one way of looking at the anti-ESG bills that we've seen is really in line with these power grabs, this preemption of a better future that these right-wing fossil fuel funded actors have pushed forward in every chamber where they have the power to do so. We've seen this with Texas taking the power of cities to regulate, gas in buildings and building electrification, to regulate things like a minimum wage. You have these power grabs coming at different levels, and this focus on state financial authority is a new front in that preemption fight.
Thank you both. All right, so some interesting research was flagged by Chaz Farner in the Q&A too. So they were talking about research that shows that exclusionary ESG approach to investing does not motivate brown firms to reduce their carbon footprint. I haven't heard brown firms before, but I assume that refers to firms that are not operating on ESG principles, though perhaps someone on the panel can clarify. But Chaz goes on to state the data suggests that these firms continue to do business as usual, sometimes increasing their pollution and beginning to cut corners. Can you speak on this and suggest a better way to invest that motivates these brown firms to make positive environmental changes? So I'll leave that one open. If anyone is interested in speaking on that, please go ahead.
Well, if those firms have not yet seen the business case associated with the clean energy economy and to proper compliance, then they're in the dark ages. So they're behind, desperately behind. But we're going to attack the sin and not the sinner. Thank you, Ty. So, we go to them, we support them, we say, look, take a look at the data, take a look at the information. I don't think that, if they're not getting capital, there's a reason, right? They need to talk to their investors. They need to look at who is getting capital. We didn't go into this in this webinar, but the broad data around ESG investing, by the way, is that it has certainly been favorable and it has yielded major returns. Guys, get with the program, okay? So if you're, and I do say guys, okay, let's just say firms. Again, it's the sin, not the sinners. I don't think anything has to change with ESG and all of our practices thus far to move major emitters. What major emitters need to do is to look at the dollars and cents, and investors need to reinforce the dollars and cents and the need for a clean energy economy and the extreme financial climate risk associated and DEI risk associated with staying in the dark ages.
Just to jump in here, Grace, this is not something that B Lab necessarily has any expertise to advise on, but I do think you should check out some of our partners over at Share Action, as well as the shareholder comments who think about this issue quite a lot.
That's a good point. Maybe we can direct to some of those resources in our follow-up. So I'm going to choose one more question here. And we'll flag, I know there's more comments and questions that we haven't gotten to yet, and we will be getting to those in the follow-up email. So I am going to be slightly self-interested and choose the question directed at B Lab here, just because I think it's important to cover. So Maureen asks, is there a B Lab program that allows members in blue states to support and coordinate activism for members in red and purple states? I can start this answer and then kick it to others on the panel. So the direct answer is no, that doesn't exist in the way you're phrasing it yet. There's no exact program for kind of a blue to red state helpline, but we are trying to think through how that can happen. There is sort of, I think, a recognized not problem, but a bit of a barrier to the fact that a lot of our B Corps are in blue states. We have really strong communities in like California and New York, but we also have strong communities elsewhere too. And how do we channel the national energy into the states that perhaps need the most attention in some ways on ESG and DEI topics? But to make this question a little bit bigger and to open it up to all the panelists, I mean, I'd be curious if anyone has insights on how we get activist bases in blue states to help shift the needle in red or purple states on these issues.
I can hop in. I think it's what was most effective is to do it topic driven as opposed to kind of red versus blue, because B Lab overall, the community has so many different interests and things. So how do you align where your passion, interests, and resources meet the need of whatever the backlash is? So you take, for instance, the question about CDFIs and the Fearless Fund. That is an example of where if you're a capital provider, if you have examples on how your economy is thrived as a result of it, how do you actually help equip and empower those groups to be able to have those talking points? So that's an example, for instance. And for what it's worth, some of the semantics that we're seeing in the shift of the SBA and supplier diversity and inclusion is one, people are starting to revert back to the words of like 10 years ago on inclusive or small and disadvantaged, and then the ... is race driven. The other piece is that there's a nuance in the way that the law is written. It's about the contract, and so whether the contract rule is around not excluding due to race, and it was supposed to be in service of not excluding Black and brown folks, and now it's being questioned on whether or not it's excluding white people. So I think it's those kind of nuances that is helpful to galvanize around.
The other piece I would mention is that if you're in a blue state, your policy makers still matter. We have rulings moving through the SEC that would standardize climate risk disclosure. There's a bill in California right now that would standardize climate risk disclosure and make that a just standard business practice for firms of a certain size. And so as we look at the opportunity that having this politicized conversation, having headlines swarming around, having this be on PBS NewsHour, that opens a door to educate the folks in blue states, your policymakers there, about the importance of all of this risk management and how we can strengthen the financial system overall and their role in it.
Great. Unfortunately, I need to stop us there. It is 2:00. I know people will probably have to hop to get to their next meetings and tasks. Thank you so much for joining us. This was, I hope it was a very educational conversation for me. I hope you all found it valuable. Thank you so much to Ty, Francis, and Anne for taking times out of their busy schedules to join us and educate us and help organize us on these issues. And please keep an eye out in your emails for a follow-up email where we'll be sharing a lot of documents and resources, opportunities, and we'll also be following up to answer some of the questions that we weren't able to get to during the call. So thank you again, and we hope to see many of you soon out in taking action on these issues and working with us to make the economy a more equitable and fair one. Thanks so much.